Tuesday, June 19th.
Questions to the Prime Minister. Question number 1, Mr. Pat Duffy.
British House of Commons. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher takes questions from members of the House of Commons 2 times each week, for 15 minutes on Tuesday afternoon and again on Thursday. On Tuesday, one of the main topics was Britain's economy. Labour leader Neil Kinnock questioned Mrs. Thatcher about the country's current interest rates and inflation. Also, Mrs. Thatcher was questioned about whether she agreed with the Labour Party agenda, which was released last month. The agenda, similar to a party platform in the U.S., proposed new tax policies to shift more of the burden off lower-income people. Another issue on Tuesday was the environment. Several members questioned Prime Minister Thatcher on the government's reports of CO2 emissions, the use of energy, and global warming. So with that, here is Prime Minister's question time from Tuesday, June 19th.
Questions to the Prime Minister. Question number 1, Mr. Pat Duffy.
Mr. Speaker, sir, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, including one with the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency and another with the foreign ministers of Bangladesh, Sudan and Somalia. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall be having further meetings later today, including one with Mr. Attlee, President-elect of the new European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which will have its headquarters in London.
Mr. Duffy.
Did the Prime Minister note the biting comment in the Sunday Quality Press that the fast revolving door through which ex-cabinet ministers are passing towards the boards of privatised industries that they themselves have set up has become a symbol of greed in high office?
In the
and as this is an entirely new development, for which and restraint are simply not enough, as we saw last week, will she consider extending to ex-ministers the same restrictions that apply to former civil servants?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in the first place, there will be 15 months between Lord Young, the noble Lord Young, leaving his office and taking up his appointment. And of course, with civil servants, the period may not be longer than that and may be shorter. But I agree with the noble Lord, the Earl of Stockton, who, when asked a similar question, said, "It is desirable and beneficial to the country that men of considerable experience should be available when they leave government to the service of industry and commerce." I quoted what the noble Lord Wilson said in similar vein last week.
Anthony Nelson.
Has my right honourable friend had an opportunity to reflect on the interview which the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, had on television?
There must be a question of which the Prime Minister has responsibility.
Question to the Prime Minister is whether she will confirm that a Conservative government will remain committed, even after the next general election, to reducing still further the direct burden of taxation on individuals, whereas the inevitable consequence of Labour policies, despite what the Leader of the Opposition said, will be to raise significantly the average burden of taxation on people in this country.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I confirm that our policy on income tax rates remains to get down the 25 pence of standard rate of income tax down to 20 as and when it is prudent to do so.
Bill Kinnock.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister tell us what she's going to do now to stop inflation reaching 10%?
Mr. Speaker, unlike the policy of the right honourable gentleman, who somehow seems to believe that if you reduce interest rates, you will cure inflation, we shall maintain our policy because the interest rates of 15% will succeed in bringing down inflation.
Mr. Speaker, doesn't the Prime Minister recall telling me early last year that they were proceeding towards zero inflation? We've had 16 more months of her policies since then, and rather than proceeding towards zero, inflation is proceeding towards double figures. Apart from trying to fix the figures, what is the Prime Minister going to do to get inflation down?
Mr. Speaker, I answer the right honourable gentleman. Does the right honourable gentleman seriously maintain his position that Does the right honourable gentleman seriously maintain his ridiculous economics by saying that to get inflation down you need to cut interest rates? That would put it up to rates that Labour were used to having.
Are there any economics more ridiculous than the one that produces the lowest growth rate of the major industrialized countries, the highest inflation rate of the major industrialized countries, the worst balance of payments position of all the major industrial countries? If the right honourable lady wants to speak about ridiculous economics, let her look at herself.
And also produces, and has for 3 years, the highest level of investment in industry we've ever had, the highest standard of living this country has ever known, the highest standard of social services this country has ever known, and the lowest levels of income tax in the post-war period. All of
Mr. Simon Burns!
Does my right honourable friend share with me the misery, frustration and expense caused by squatters who occupy privately owned homes? Will she accept that providing no damage is done to securely locked houses, there is nothing the police can do before an order is got from a court? And does she not think it's time that the balance of the law was redressed to favour the innocent homeowner rather than the reprehensible activities of squatters?
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman is aware, squatting which directly excludes a householder from his home is already a criminal offence. The police can act and penalties are severe, but squatting in property, residential property, which does not carry this immediate threat of causing homelessness, can only be recovered by a civil action and not by a crime. I agree with the honourable gentleman that there appears to be something wrong in this law. It should also, many of us think that criminal offence appears to be something wrong in this law, so there appears to be a defect in this law, and I'm looking into the matter further.
Graham Allen.
Number 2, sir. Global warming.
Sir, there have already been several such international conferences over the last year. International initiatives on climate change are primarily dealt with through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Its support will be considered carefully and fully at the Second World Climate Conference this autumn, which I hope to address.
Mr. Graham Allen.
Prime Minister may talk green, she may even dress green, but it's the same old blue policies underneath. Will the Prime Minister admit that what people at home know is that her complacency on global warming, on the depletion of the ozone layer, on the running down of our environment, on the degradation of our wildlife, has all taken place under this government? Will she now, instead of bleating at that dispatch box, will she come forward with a practical plan of action for our environment so that her last year isn't as wasted in environmental terms as her first 11 years?
Will the honourable gentleman look up the record of the last Labour government, which after a directive of 1975 from the Commission did nothing about water or beaches, did nothing even to identify, let alone clean them up. We have cleaned up 3/4 of them and have a programme to clean up the rest. That we're also doing a great deal more with rivers. We have the best record on cleanliness of rivers of any country in Europe. Perhaps he's forgotten this. We have a very good record on calling the Ozone Conference and setting the targets, and we shall have one shortly. Perhaps the honourable gentleman, instead of making those remarks, would look at his own record and see that a Labour government did nothing but cut capital expenditure and made the environment worse.
Mr. Peter Rost.
Right honourable friend, take another look at a number of reputable studies which indicate that this country can not only stabilise its greenhouse gases, but actually reduce them without any financial penalty or pain simply because through greater efficiency in the production and use of energy, we can actually get a cost saving, higher productivity, and a more competitive economy.
Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend is aware, I did give a certificate to a house which had very high energy and efficiency yesterday and had led the way, and it was the first one, in fact, to secure that particular certificate. I agree with him that industry has already done a great deal to improve its energy efficiency as a way of keeping down its costs, and will do a good deal more. And the particular companies have done a good deal of research which will make them more energy efficient than ever before. I think that the target that we have set of getting back to 1990 levels by the year 2005 is a good one. It is the right timescale, and it has been confirmed by the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Wally.
Will the Prime Minister accept that her government's projections of CO2 emissions are in fact a gross overestimate and in fact misleading? Isn't she, despite today's green mantle, conning the British public about what she's doing on green issues? And will she give a commitment to the House that she will make available to it for full public inspection the detailed information about government scientific reports about the level of CO2 emissions which contribute to global warming?
Mr. Speaker, I noticed that the Labour Party tried to sustain that argument the other day, and they were completely blown out of the water. In fact, the CBI totally agreed with our targets, and also that the target has been confirmed by Dr. Houghton, who has the best available evidence, and he said 15-year period is an appropriate timescale. It's a significant step towards reducing the rate of climate change during the next 15 years, by the end of which substantial improvement in the accuracy of the scientific assessment should be expected. This has all, in fact, been based upon sound science.
Mr. Robbins, Squire.
Friend confirm that CFCs are a greenhouse gas much more damaging in equivalent weight than CO2s, and that the steps we've taken there as a government, beating the target of Montreal Protocol, deserve praise even from the opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we have indeed done that, beating the Montreal Protocol, and we hope to set new targets again at the conference which we shall hold next week. My honourable friend is quite right. CFCs are a very damaging greenhouse gas, so also is methane, and some people would wish to take as their targets not only the CO2 emissions, but the CO2 equivalent, which takes into account the CFCs and the methane gas as well.
Bill Mickey.
Which I gave some moments ago.
Mr. Mickey.
Mr. Speaker, why is the Prime Minister still insisting that the National Health Service is safe in her hands when there's chronic underfunding throughout the country, and indeed in the Sheffield Area Health Authority over 1 million underfunding, which has resulted in 108 beds being closed and plans to close 2 more hospitals? Surely the Prime Minister should have the courage to accept that it's better for her to lose her face than patients to lose their lives.
For the taxpayer, under the rate of growth we've had under Conservative government, to be able to go to finance the health service from an amount of 11 billion a year in 1979 to 7 billion a year in 1979, to 29 billion a year is a great tribute both to the growth we've had under this government and to the way in which we've been able to divert quite a bit of that growth to improving the health service in a way which the Labour Party could never have done.
Sir Robert McCrindle.
Mr. Speaker, reverting to the earlier question, as some organisations like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth appear to be dissatisfied with our progress on matters such as global warming and other environmental issues, does she not think the time has come when they should be asked to cost their rather more ambitious proposals? Does she agree with me that although all of us would like to see a greener environment, evidently not all of us are prepared to face the financial consequences?
Very good. Speaker, my honourable friend is quite right that to make the environment much better does cost money, whether it be in electricity or gas or whether it be in water. Of course, we should be able to have to improve and reduce the carbon dioxide emissions if we had a greater amount of nuclear energy. But those who urge us to reduce them further are often those who detest nuclear energy, or those from the Labour Party who in fact want to keep all the coal mines open to in fact generate all of our electricity from coal.
Rosie Barnes! Mrs. Barnes.
I refer the Honourable Lady to the reply which I gave some moments ago.
Mrs. Barnes.
Given reports in today's Independent of a rift between the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health on the timing of the introduction of the community care reforms outlined in the National Health Service and Community Care Bill, will she assure the House that if and when these reforms are introduced, their funding will be ring-fenced and she will not seek to overturn the amendment passed to this effect in another place?
The government set out its proposals in the White Paper, and the bill, which has been extensively debated in both houses, is a major changes in community care. The planning is going ahead well, and it remains the government's intention that these changes will get underway this coming year as from April 1991. It is not universally accepted by any means that the funding should be by specific grant. Indeed, many local authorities prefer it to be in the ordinary aggregate exchequer grant and not by specific grant.
10-minute rule motion, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
That concludes Prime Minister's question time for Tuesday. Members of the House of Commons then went on to other business. Now on to Thursday. The main issue Thursday was Britain's relationship with the European community. Members first discussed a recent decision by the European Court of Justice in a case involving a lawsuit filed against the British government by the Spanish fishing industry over a law on fishing quotas in British waters. Britain's House of Lords refused to grant an injunction to the fishermen while the case was being decided. But the EC court ruled that this was contrary to EC law and ordered the Lords to grant the injunction. Thus, the EC court ruled that British courts could suspend acts of Parliament that infringe on rights guaranteed by EC laws. Unlike the United States, there is no right of courts in Britain to strike down laws. Members of the House of Commons also discussed the European monetary system. On Wednesday night, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Major, delivered a speech in which he made a proposal to create a new hard currency that would be common to all European community nations, the European Currency Unit, known as the ICU. Right now, the EC has an ICU, but is not a hard currency. It is only a unit by which European financiers balance payments among countries. Its value is determined by the values of all the regular currencies of the EC countries, except Britain. Britain is not a member of the European monetary system. Members questioned Margaret Thatcher over whether the statement made by the Chancellor of the Exchequer indicates a move towards joining that system. So with that background, here is Prime Minister's question time from Thursday, June 21st.
Questions to the Prime Minister. Question number 1, Mr. Ronnie Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, sir, this morning I presided at a meeting of the Cabinet and had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall be having further meetings later today, including one with the Mayor of Paris, Monsieur Jacques Chirac, and this evening I shall preside at a dinner in honour of the Crown Prince of Morocco.
Mr. Campbell.
Will the Prime Minister now commission an inquiry by the Social Service Inspectorate into and establish the allegations that staff shortages in Wandsworth Council resulted in the death of a 3-year-old child?
No, Mr. Speaker. Obviously that case, a tragic case, affected us all grievously. As the honourable gentleman is aware, the death of that child occurred in August 1989. The details of the case are being thoroughly looked into. Wandsworth Council had already spent a great deal on that case, including at one stage removing the family to another place of residence at the cost of some £15,000, moving them to a residential home, and then back into a council house. Wandsworth itself has a very, very good record on social very good record on social workers, having something like 4% of social workers more in relation to its population than other inner London authorities. Yes, it is a very tragic case, and of course there has been an inquiry, and of course the recommendations will be accepted from that inquiry.
Lieutenant Taylor?
Is the Prime Minister at all concerned that the European Court on Tuesday instructed our courts to consider interim relief from sections of the Merchant Shipping Bill, although the House of Lords had decided that they had no powers to do so? And although we obviously accept that the European law is supreme over our own law, isn't it a very dangerous development when the court is taking on effectively the power to suspend sections of laws passed by this Parliament? And will this not open up the possibility and likelihood that groups and individuals will seek relief from laws passed by this Parliament simply by going to the court and claiming that they are lost in consequence?
Mr. Speaker, I share my honourable friend's concern about this judgment. As he said, since the European Communities Act 1972, our courts are obliged to protect rights under community law, but the European Court have now said that where those rights are impaired by British law, our courts have the power to grant an injunction until the main case is heard. That applies, as my honourable friend says, even though the injunction may affect the operation of an act of our own Parliament. But the European Court have left it to our courts whether or not to exercise that power. The particular case in question, therefore, now goes back to our own courts to decide whether that power to give interim relief should be used. I may say that we shall be arguing strongly that it should not. And meanwhile, the position as to fishing rights remains quite unchanged. I should point out that the European Court's decision applies to all European countries, not only to the United Kingdom.
Mr. Neil Kinnock.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree with the statement that the proposals put forward by the Chancellor last night are a very useful intermediate step towards a single European currency, which is the view and indeed the words of the Governor of the Bank of England?
Not quite what my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, said. I thought it was... That is not quite what my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, said in a most excellent and constructive speech, which I hope... welcomed as both building on the present position, going forward in an evolutionary way, and bearing in mind that many other countries may wish to join the community, not making it more difficult to do so. It does not mean that we approve of a single European currency. It says specifically that we do not. It provides for a common European currency which each country may use if they wish to do so. It does not, therefore, take away from our sovereignty in any way. It provides a way of trying to get inflation down by reference to a hard ECU. I was not quite sure from what the right honourable gentleman said whether he'd read the speech or if he'd read it, whether he'd understood it.
Mr. Speaker, by all means I read the speech. I wonder if the Chancellor explained to the right honourable lady that if the idea that he put forward were to be accepted with the European Monetary Fund and the hard AQ, that it would be the final surrender of monetary sovereignty by Britain as sterling moved into the hard AQ. Does she take that into account in the view that she expresses about what the Chancellor said?
But that speech and that proposal is precisely so that we do not, in fact, surrender control over our own monetary policy. Of course, we wish to use monetary policy in a way that gets inflation down. It does not surrender control over that policy.
I'm grateful to the right honourable lady, and these are important matters, So is she saying in the responses that she's made thus far that when the Governor of the Bank of England says to the House of Lords yesterday that a European monetary fund and a hard AQ would, and I quote him precisely, be a very useful intermediate step between the existing EC currencies and a single EC currency, that the Governor is wrong in the opinion of the Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I suggest the right honourable gentleman reads more carefully the speech of my right honourable friend the Chancellor. My right honourable friend the Chancellor, which is proposing building on the existing ECU, of which the City has in fact already issued securities denominated in ECU, building on the existing ECU to have a hard ECU which could become a common European currency available for countries to use if they so chose. It retains the choice, it retains sterling.
Mr. Bill Walker.
Number 3, sir.
It's all right. I shall come back to it. Mr. Bill Walker.
Number 3, sir.
I defer my honourable friend to the reply which I gave some moments ago.
Mr. Bill Walker.
Is my right honourable friend aware that in the 11 years of her leadership, the economy of Scotland has been transformed into a dynamic, vibrant, modern economy? Can she confirm that she has no plans to introduce an Assembly Act that would give Scotland an assembly in Edinburgh with tax-raising powers that would put in jeopardy that modern, vibrant economy?
Yeah, yeah. Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. Scotland is doing better than ever before because of the policies of this government, which Scotland has taken to very well indeed and is using profitably to her own advantage. We have no plans to introduce an assembly that would mean more taxation on the Scottish people. Indeed, if you take all of the own Scottish spending, it would mean that if they had to bear all spending in Scotland themselves, an extra 20 pence on the standard rate of income tax in Scotland.
John McCallion.
Scotland.
Number 2.
I hope to visit the northeast of Scotland later this year.
Mr. McCallion.
Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister aware that the Speedlink rail freight service, which serves the northeast of Scotland, faces closure because of her plans to sell off parts of British Rail? And is she also aware that such a closure will lead to 100,000 tonnes of timber being moved from rail onto road and will create an extra 18,000 lorry movements every year on Scotland's already overcrowded roads? Now, given that these developments make neither sense in economic or in environmental terms, will the Prime Minister accept that this time, the Prime Minister accept that this time the price to be paid by the rest of us for her personal obsession with privatisation is really too high, and that she should instruct British Rail to retain the existing Speedlink services?
Mr. Speaker, well, some of us think when we visit Scotland and travel on her roads that her roads are very, very much better than those down south and not nearly so crowded, because she's had an enormous amount spent on them, and may I point out to the honourable gentleman that current investment levels in British Railways are the highest in real terms for a quarter of a century, 3.7 billion to be invested over the next 3 years.
Bellingham.
Number 4, sir.
I refer my honourable friend to the reply which I gave some moments ago.
Mr. Bellingham.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister share the very widely felt concern about human rights in Romania? Would you agree that neither Britain nor the EEC should extend any further assistance in the present circumstances, except obviously purely humanitarian help?
Mr. Speaker, I share my honourable friend's concern. After all the Romanian people have been through, we're absolutely horrified to see the scenes which happened again on television and the violence being used by the miners. And we're also very much concerned about the fate of some of the demonstrators. Concerned about the fate of some of the demonstrators which have been arrested. We've invoked the Helsinki Agreement to seek information from the Romanian government about their fate. In the meantime, the European Community is quite right. They refused to sign a trade and cooperation agreement, as my honourable friend realised, with Romania, and Romania will not be invited to the ministerial meeting of the Group of 24 on the 4th of July to discuss aid to Eastern Europe. We think that this was a proper response to the scenes which we saw and witnessed on television.
Ashton.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister realise that whatever the flaws, and I suspect there will be fatal flaws in the Chancellor's proposals, new proposals for competing currencies, it is nevertheless very welcome that her cabinet colleagues, or at least some of them, have managed to lever her forward an inch or two on Europe. But she has said that this is an evolutionary approach. An evolutionary approach must have an objective. Will she now really repeat to the House what she has said before, that she does not believe that Britain should or will, in her lifetime, join a single European currency or a Central European bank?
Mr. Speaker, I think that the proposals outlined by my right honourable friend are the right way ahead. It builds on the existing ECU. We have issued securities denominated in ECUs. It meets the wish of many people to have a common currency, which is quite different from a single currency. It builds a common currency as the new ECU, and that means that those who wish to use that in place of their own currency may. I do not believe we shall. It also provides protection against inflation, and further, it would not be an impediment to many countries from Eastern Europe who may wish to join us later, whereas if we tied ourselves up too closely and in fact relinquished our monetary powers to a central authority, they would not wish to join, and neither should we wish to relinquish the powers of this House.
Michael Irvin.
Number 5, sir.
I refer my honourable friend to the reply which I gave some moments ago.
Would my right honourable friend agree that regional airports play a crucial role in stimulating growth in the areas which they serve? And would she therefore join me in expressing astonishment at the crass, blinkered and short-sighted attitude shown by the Labour-controlled Ipswich Borough Council, which are intent on closing down Ipswich Airport, even though no suitable alternative site has yet been found?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The government wishes to see the maximum use of airports in the regions to meet as much local demand as they can attract. And since 1981, we've given borrowing approvals for over £287 million. We have given...
Order! The Prime Minister.
We have given borrowing approvals totalling over £287 million for the development of local authority airports. And I hope that a new site can be found quickly for this one. I understand that discussions have already taken place between Suffolk County Council and the Ministry of Defence. Clearly, honourable members opposite aren't in the least bit interested in a new airport for Ipswich.
Order! Order! This takes a lot of time, and the Prime Minister is seeking to answer the question.
Not interested, Mr. Speaker. Discussions have already taken place between Suffolk County Council and the Ministry of Defence about the possible use of RAF Wattisham. We are interested in regional airports if the opposition are.
Business questions!
That concludes Prime Minister's question time from Thursday. The House then went on to other business. If you would like more information about the House of Commons and how it works, you can write to the House of Commons Public Information Office at this address. If you would like to write Mrs. Thatcher, use this address. if you would like to write any member of the House of Commons, this address will work.